Thank you very much. On the 31st of October, the much anticipated and groundbreaking fifth King Code on corporate governance was launched. And we can quite rightly ask, why the fuss? Well, it's because King 5 truly marks the start of a new era in corporate governance, one that raises the bar for performance, reliability, and transparency. It takes everything we know from the earlier codes and refines it, weaving in modern sustainability principles, simplifying the framework, and making governance guidance far more practical and accessible. What really stands out in King 5, though, is the language. King 5 introduces powerful concepts like impact materiality, Ubuntu, and refreshed definitions of sustainability and value creation. These aren't just new terms, they signal a real shift, one that embeds ESG and business and human rights considerations right at the core of South Africa's corporate governance model. By focusing on impact and impact materiality, King 5 really pushes organizations to think beyond financial performance, to look at how their operations affect people, communities, and the planet. And the inclusion of Ubuntu, that distinctly South African philosophy of shared humanity and ethical responsibility, gives the code its soul. It reinforces the idea that good governance isn't just about compliance. It's about connection, accountability, and creating value that benefits everyone. I am Liezl Groenewald, the CEO of the Ethics Institute, and I welcome you to this webinar, where we will examine the implications of King 5 for corporate governance and organizational ethics management. It is a real pleasure to acknowledge our supporters and our sponsors, and then people from 35 countries, truly illustrating our global footprint and global impact. I welcome all of you to this session. Our program today will be as follows. First, we will have Ansie Ramalho, who is the chairperson of the King Committee and the King 5 Advisory Committee. And Ansie will reflect on the need for King 5 and its impact on corporate governance. Ansie will be followed by Prof. Deon, who is a member of the King 5 Advisory Committee. And Deon will reflect on the implications of King 5 for ethics management. Now let me introduce our distinguished speakers. I think first I must say congratulations, Ansie, and congratulations, Deon. This was a long process, so congratulations on the publication of this long-awaited and much anticipated Code on Good Governance. Ansie is a lawyer by training and considered a leading authority on corporate governance with both theoretical and applied knowledge on the topic. She strongly believes that corporate governance can and should be harnessed for the benefit of the economy, society, and the natural environment. In her governance leadership, she serves as the chairperson of the King Committee, as already stated, and has been a member since 2009. She led the development and drafting of the King 5 report, issued in 2025, which marked another milestone in the evolution of corporate governance in South Africa and reinforced the King Commission's global leadership in governance thinking. But that is not all. Beyond committee work, she is professional non-executive director and is currently the chairperson of KPMG South Africa and a board member of the Integrated Reporting Committee of South Africa. Additionally, Ansie is a member of the Financial Reporting Standards Council, appointed by the Minister of Trade and Industry and Competition. Ansie is a Chartered Director, South Africa, and is also an examiner for this designation. Beyond committee work, she is an active contributor to the field of corporate governance and company law, offering consulting and training services. She facilitates director development programs offered by the Institute of Directors of South Africa, University of Johannesburg, and for sponsors appointed by the Johannesburg Stock Exchange. Additionally, she offers corporate governance consulting services on an ad hoc basis to corporate clients. Welcome, Ansie. We are really honored to have you with us today. Our second speaker is Professor Deon Rossouw. Deon is the chairperson of the International Banknote Ethics Initiative, an extraordinary professor in applied ethics at Stellenbosch University, and a corporate governance facilitator at the Institute of Directors of South Africa. Deon obtained a doctoral degree in philosophy at Stellenbosch University, where he was also the chairperson of the Student Representative Council. His academic career started at the Rand Afrikaans University, now University of Johannesburg, where he became professor and head of the philosophy department. And he served on the executive committee of the university. He then moved to the University of Pretoria, where he was the head of the philosophy department and director of the Center for Business Ethics and Business and Professional Ethics. He spent a year as program executive for business ethics at the GlobeEthics.net Foundation in Geneva, Switzerland, after which he joined the Ethics Institute as CEO from 2011 till 2024. Deon is an internationally recognized expert in business ethics and the ethics of corporate governance, and he published several books as well as academic articles in leading international academic journals. Deon was the founding president of the Business Ethics Network of Africa and also served as president of the International Society of Business, Economics and Ethics. Deon is a member of the King Committee for Corporate Governance in South Africa and also chaired the Social and Ethics Committee Forum of the IOD-SA. He has been recognized as a chartered director by the Institute of Directors of South Africa, and he serves in executive and non-executive positions on governing bodies and advisory committees. Now, I think we can agree that we have the best of the best here to talk to us about King 5, our new extraordinary, groundbreaking code on good governance in South Africa. Ansie, I hand over to you. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Liezl, for that kind introduction, and it's really an honor and a pleasure to join you this morning. So to introduce the session, I thought I would give you a brief overview of what the King Committee is, for those of you perhaps do not know, and then just a sense of what the King reports are and how these reports are distinct from their counterparts internationally. So the King Committee is truly a committee. It hasn't been incorporated by regulation or by legislation, which is a truly remarkable thing, that it has existed for about 30 years in its current format and enjoying the legitimacy and the credibility that it does. The King Committee started its work in 1992 about when the Institute of Directors in South Africa approached Judge Mervyn King to chair a committee on corporate governance. This came in anticipation of the Cadbury report that was due to be issued in the UK at that time. South Africa was transitioning into a democracy, and the thinking was that to encourage foreign direct investment, that we should have a corporate governance code to give international investors confidence in the South African market. At that point in time, of course, we never anticipated that it will exist for 30 years and still be going strong at this point in time. And especially, as I said, in its current format, as really just a committee. The committee doesn't have government support. It's not a regulator, other than being what is called a soft regulator. It receives sponsorship and practical support from the Institute of Directors where it is housed. The role of the Institute of Directors is just as a facilitator, a support function, an administrative function. The IOD does not dictate the content of the King codes and reports in any form. So what distinguishes the King reports from their counterparts? Now, when you talk about corporate governance, one should always start with legal duties, because the legal duties of directors and others in governance positions. Legal duties is the foundation, the basis of corporate governance. The function of corporate governance is to make those legal duties practical, to give substance to those legal duties. If you think about the legal duties as they appear in the Companies Act and in other pieces of legislation, it's really that those are in positions of governance must act with loyalty in the best interest of the organization. That's the first part. And the second part is that they must act with due care, skill, and diligence. Now, acting in the best interest of an organization, acting with due care, skill, and diligence, those are relatively abstract concepts. What it looks like in practice is what the governance principles and the practices provide. It falls in that picture. Now, the traditional definition of corporate governance is then the system by which organizations or companies are directed and controlled. And the system, of course, it consists of various operational practices and structures that are put in place. And from this idea has developed the notion of best practices for how organizations should be managed and controlled, in other words, governed. Mostly these practices are internally focused on what committees you need to have, what the membership of these committees need to look like, what your board composition needs to look like. So this is all the traditional domain of corporate governance, which we in South Africa and also internationally, corporate governance codes deal with extensively. There's one tweak to the code for corporate governance in South Africa that we introduced in King 4, and that is that these practices need to result in certain outcomes for the organization where governance is applied. Those outcomes can also be understood as the value, the benefits that must be generated for an organization through the governance efforts of its governing body. What those governance outcomes look like is it talks about ethical culture of the organization, which we will of course talk about much more today. It also means performance and value creation. And then the counterpart to it, the counterbalance to it, conformance and prudent control. That includes compliance aspects. It of course includes effective internal controls And then also accountability. That's what we mean under conformance and prudent control. And then the last outcome of the fourth one, legitimacy. Legitimacy is what we refer to when an organization has earned its social license, its social permission to operate. It has legitimacy. It's trustworthy and it evidences that trustworthiness through transparency. So that's the first tweak, that yes, there are practices, but good corporate governance is not simply having implemented these practices also need to result in value for the organization in the form of outcomes. But then there's a bigger question that needs to be asked around corporate governance. And it's around this bigger question that the King reports differentiated themselves since King 1 actually already, but then it progressed and evolved over time to where we are now with King 5. So when we talk about corporate governance and the practices that you need to implement, the system that you need to implement within an organization, we're really referring to the means of governance. How are organizations governed? What do you need to put in place? What structures do you need? What policies do you need? What processes do you need? That's a very important question, but that's not the ultimate question. The ultimate question is, what is the purpose of governance? What are we actually aiming to achieve through governance? Now, the answer, I want to say traditionally, but I think it's still prevalent in many areas, sectors, etc., is that what we're trying to achieve through governance is to maximize shareholder value. And as Milton said in his famous 1970 article, he said that we need to create shareholder value. That is the reason for the existence of companies, as long as that pursuit happens within the bounds of social and legal rules. But we subsequently learned that in the real world, governance considerations go way beyond the narrow focus on shareholder wealth maximization. What we often forget, because corporations are so much part of our society, we're so used to corporations being around and doing what they do, operating as they do, being part of the economy, that we forget that corporations are really simply a way by which human endeavor is organized. And surely if corporations then originate from a societal purpose, it must return to societal purpose. It must deliver societal benefits. In this world where we live in, the real world, not the make-up world of new classical economics, in this real world, organizations and the economies within which they operate are embedded within societies, and societies are embedded within the natural environment, which means that organizations are completely dependent on the health and the resilience of the societal systems and the environmental systems by which they are surrounded. So it is in the organization's own interest to contribute to the wealth of these and the vitality of these systems. That doesn't mean that there's anything wrong with profit generation and creating wealth for shareholders. All that is good, and I would say necessary for for-profit organizations. If I talk about creating shareholder value, you can also understand it in the context of state-owned entities, where state-owned entities is seen as generating wealth for the shareholder ministries. But ultimately, it's really about service delivery to citizens. So nothing wrong with profit, but profit can't come through extracting value from society and the natural environment. That is absolutely, this is the opposite of what sustainability is. I get back to the idea that organizations, companies, other types of organizations, entities are all social institutions. And where we find ourselves as humanity, this precipice that we're facing, it may not be enough. In fact, it's definitely not enough to say to ourselves that our organization should not cause harm. That's not taking it far enough. We need a fundamental shift. Our organizations need to create value for the systems within which they operate, not just be neutral. That's no longer enough. So for those of you who are a little bit skeptical and think this is a radical idea, may I remind you that responsible corporate citizenship is one of the functions of the Social and Ethics Committee, which is a statutory committee in terms of the Companies Act. The Bill of Rights, as contained in the Constitution, provide that legal persons in companies, organizations, entities, that those legal persons are bound to protect human rights. Our organizations can't walk away with it from this. This is enshrined in our law and in our constitution. And then, as Liezl mentioned, this is also rooted in African philosophy. So for us as Africans, this shouldn't be a foreign concept. If we think about Ubuntu, I am because you are because we are, pointing to that interconnectedness, that interdependence that we have as human beings on one another. If you think of organizations as just a way by which human endeavor is organized, then surely this thinking should filter through to organizations. The board to philosophy, which same as Ubuntu, Kimutu Kabatu, I'm a person through other people. So our code of corporate governance in the form of King 5 is imbued with these values. And to just conclude, we see corporate governance in King 5, and this is not an entirely new thinking. This is an evolutionary, has been an evolutionary process, a journey. We see corporate governance as outcomes-based, and particularly we see corporate governance not only as the principles and the practices that are applied. We see it as something that should be driven through purpose. What is the purpose, the reason for our organizations? And that is what should inform governance thinking. That is what should inform the thinking of our governing bodies ultimately. And so when we talk about acting in the best interest of the organization in King 5, we always qualify that by saying acting in the best interest of the organization within its economic, social, and environmental context. So I'll conclude there. Thank you.
Sure. Thank you, Ansie. Sorry, Deon. Thank you, Ansie, for setting the scene so eloquently. And already I can see there are questions based on what you have presented to us. So we now hand over to Prof. Deon Rossouw. Deon, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Liezl, and thank you also, Ansie, for setting the scene for us. And also from my side, congratulations on pulling this one off. Your leadership and vision for King 5 was really what pulled it through in the end. Now, my input will be a short one in which I would just like to share with you 3 key insights related to the governance of ethics in King 5. And the very first one, the very first insight has to do with the fact that ethics really sits at the heart of corporate governance in King 5, as it has been the case in the previous iterations of the King report. Now, here you can see on your screen now the King 5 definition of corporate governance. It says corporate governance is the exercise of ethical and effective leadership by the governing body towards the realization of the following governance outcomes for the organization within its economic, social, and environmental context. And then it lists those 4 outcomes. But let me just portray it somewhat differently. When we govern organizations, our typical responsibilities is to steer the organization and set it on a strategic direction, and then to approve policies and planning that flow from that strategic plan and strategic objectives, and that will ultimately enable the realization thereof. But then it is also the responsibility of the governing body or the board of directors, if you want to exercise on an ongoing basis oversight and to monitor whether we are in fact moving in the desired strategic direction. And then our final responsibility is to do account of the performance of the organization to its stakeholders. But Ansie already mentioned that the test for good governance is not in whether you can tick the 4 boxes of steering and setting direction, policy, approving policy and planning, exercising oversight and monitoring, and doing account to your stakeholders through reporting. But the real test is in whether we deliver a certain value for the organization in the form of 4 key outcomes, which you also already mentioned, namely an ethical culture, sustained value creation and good performance, conformance and prudent control, legitimacy in the sense that we are trusted as a responsible member of the societies in which we operate. Now, if we look at this definition, and we also look at the way in which it is portrayed here in the slide that I've just shared with you, you can see that ethics really belongs to the very heart and essence of good corporate governance. Because governance is described as both ethical and effective leadership, and one of the outcomes is an ethical culture. So that is also reflected in the very first of the 13 principles that we find in King 5, the one that says the governing body leads ethically and effectively as the focal point of corporate governance in the organization. So the first key insight for me, looking at King 5 and the role of ethics, is that ethics really sits at the very heart of good governance. In other words, we can't talk good governance without talking about ethics. The second key insight for me relates to the role that King 5 is giving to the Social and Ethics Committee. Now, for the benefit of our members of the audience who come from different countries and who are not so intimately familiar with our local legislation, in our Companies Act, there is a committee that certain categories of companies must have. It's a statutory mandatory committee called the Social and Ethics Committee, and this committee has two jobs. The first one is to monitor whether the company comply with relevant legislation and codes of best practice regarding its role and impact on the economy, in its own workplace, in its external social environment, as well as in the natural environment. And then the committee must report if it picks up non-compliance, and that reporting is on an ongoing basis to the board of directors, but also once a year a report by the Social and Ethics Committee to the shareholders at the company's annual is to boards of directors should consider giving additional responsibilities to this committee over and above its statutory duties. And you can see there in the practice guidance on Principle 6, it says that the terms of reference of the Social and Ethics Committee must include reference to its statutory duties. And that's a plain fact, because these are described or prescribed by law. But then it says generally it's delegated role. In other words, the board, the governing body, can give additional responsibilities to this committee, and it says this should include organisational ethics. Now, it might sound a bit strange, but in the statutory mandate of the Social and Ethics Committee, the committee does not have a governance of ethics mandate. And that is why King 4 and now again King 5 recommended that organizational ethics should become part of the mandate of that committee. Then, very important, it also says what should be included in that delegated role is that the committee should assess the impact and outcomes of the organization's activities and outputs on the resources and relationships that it uses and affects, as well as on its economic, social, and environmental context. Now, you might recall that the statutory mandate only talk about monitoring compliance. And here you can see once again an expansion of the role to also monitor and outcomes. In other words, how are other parties, our resources that we rely on, and our stakeholders affected by this? And then finally, it also says it should also include the management of stakeholder relationships. So this is quite a strengthening and a broadening of the mandate of this key structure that you will see in a moment is very, very central when it comes to the governance of ethics in organization. And this is the third insight that I would like to share with you by way of wrapping up. And that is the second principle of King 5 that says the governing body governs the ethics of the organization in a way that enables an ethical culture and responsible corporate citizenship. So there you can see that there are two outcomes of the governance of ethics. I portrayed it like on the next slide, that you govern the ethics of the organization. The governing body takes that responsibility in a way that then enables, on the one side, an ethical culture, and on the other side, responsible corporate citizenship. Now, what is quite unique, even to some extent on a global scale, is that we often find in corporate governance codes that there are principles dealing with the governance of ethics and the internal ethical culture, and then other principles that deals with responsible corporate citizenship or corporate social responsibility. But very often these two live on separate planets. And I think one of the unique things about King 5 is that it now brings them together and say that the governance of ethics has both an internal dimension, which is building, cultivating an ethical culture over time, and then also the outcome of being a responsible member of the context in which you operate. And here, once again, both the organizational ethics and the responsible corporate citizenship is linked directly with the Social and Ethics Committee. And here you can see the recommended practice under Principle 2, when it deals specifically with organizational ethics. It says the governing body, in other words, the board, should provide strategic direction and be accountable for the organization's management of ethics, creating an ethical culture. But then it follows by saying that the board may, at its discretion, delegate that ethics-related responsibility to the Social and Ethics Committee. And we get a mirror image of that when it comes to the other aspect of responsible corporate citizenship. Once again, the governing body providing the strategic direction, but then it once again can delegate that responsibility to its Social and Ethics Committee. So, Liezl, with that, I think 3 key insights that are important for our conversation on ethics and the governance and management of ethics within the context of King 5.
Thank you very much, Deon. You can see the hands and hearts on the screen. Most valuable for our attendees to listen, how Principle 2, how are we going to now apply this practically? So thank you for those insights and reflections. And I will now move over to ask a few questions. I just want to ask our audience, please post your questions in the Q&A and not in the chat. We can't answer the questions in the chat for technical reasons, so please just ask them in the Q&A. In the meantime, I am going to ask a few questions, and I'll start with you, Ansie. There's another notable difference between King 4 and King 5, in that King 5 now has a disclosure framework. So although both said apply and explain, you have now provided organizers or companies with the means to actually disclose. So how do you expect this change in the way that organizations must report, and how stakeholders should interpret these governance disclosures? Do you foresee that it will be a difficult process for organizations to get used to initially? And I might also ask, is it going to be monitored?
Thank you, Liezl. Let me maybe take one step back and explain what the problem is that we're trying to address. So for everyone who's not so familiar with the King application regime, the King Code is voluntary guidance. That's the unnuanced view, but that's generally true, that it is voluntary guidance. In other words, it's not legislation. It's not enforced through formal sanction. I must qualify that a bit and say that the JSE, the Johannesburg Stock Exchange, has incorporated some of the practices as recommended in King 5 in its listings requirements, and therefore through that they have become mandatory. But other than these particular practices that have been incorporated, the JSE then also says in its listings rules that the remainder of the King Code needs to be applied and explained. Now, with a voluntary code, and that's the same with voluntary codes or soft regulation as it's called, the key to making soft regulation work, to making voluntary guidance works is to activate market sanction and social sanction. And market sanction and social sanction can only work if there's transparency. So what I'm saying is that it's only when there's transparency around what corporate governance practices are implemented, how they're implemented, that investors can then decide that whether they want to invest in a company, or whether they want to remain invested in a company. And then the sanction that gets employed is that those investors may decide not to invest, which affects the share price, if I can put it in a simplistic way, or they can sell their shares and say, we walk away from this company. But this has become wider, and this is linked to the legitimacy outcome of corporate governance. If organizations if they're not governed well, then they lose their legitimacy. Eskom is a good example of an entity, a state-owned entity that lost a lot of its legitimacy. It's recovering it, and I'm so grateful for it. But that's an example of what could happen if an organization is not governed well. So transparency and disclosure as to how governance is taking place is absolutely key to make a voluntary code of governance principles and practices work. Now, with King 4, we had, as one of our key ambitions when we drafted King 4, that we wanted disclosure to become more qualitative and meaningful. I've mentioned before that with corporate governance, and Deon's also referred to it, that for us, corporate governance is about the outcomes that are achieved for the organization. It's not about how many practices you've implemented. So we said, well, we don't know how many practices you've implemented. We don't want you to tick the boxes, even on your disclosure. No, not quantitative disclosure, qualitative disclosure, meaningful disclosure. But looking back on it, the narrative approach that we followed, we wanted organizations to tell the story, to explain how they were governing key governance areas such as risk, such as assurance, ethics, stakeholders, and so on. Asking of organizations to provide that narrative was perhaps not concrete enough. And so what we've seen in governance disclosures since King, actually that's been a longer standing problem, hence our ambition in King 4. But what we've seen over the years in governance disclosures is that the governance disclosures are very general. They use boilerplate language. You can cut and paste from one organization to another and never be the wiser. So that made it very difficult to really form an assessment of how this organization is governed and the quality of governance at the organization. So for us as the King Committee, we proposed the framework as the solution. The framework standardizes disclosures. It makes it accessible because it's accessible from one point. Currently, governance disclosures can be made in any organizational report and in any place within that report. So you find those disclosures dispersed across reports and then within a particular report. So the framework makes it accessible because all your governance disclosures, all your King 5 disclosures are in one place, and we're very precise about what we want organizations to disclose. Now, this framework must be posted on organizations' websites, and we say if you don't use the framework, you cannot claim adoption of King 5. It is part and parcel of adoption of King 5. That the content as provided through the framework must be approved by the governing body. The governing body needs to sign off on it, just like it signs off on any other organizational report, and even more so now where it's governance. And then I also need to mention, to the latter part of your question, Liezl, the enforcement. The governance framework is now endorsed by a number of regulators and professional bodies, among them the Auditor General, National Treasury, IRBA, our Regulatory Board for Auditors, the DTIC, our Companies Office, and the JSE, of course, as well as the Financial Sector Conduct Authority. That endorsement, I think, is so significant because it indicates an uptick in the enforcement and monitoring of governance disclosures in future. I think this will be the big game changer of King 5, is we get this disclosure right, and if we get the monitoring and enforcement of it right, and I've explained how important transparency is to make the code work, then I think this can be the game changer.
Wonderful. Thank you, Ansie, and thank you for explaining the importance of transparency. I'm going to refer to that when I ask Deon the question, my first question to him. But Ansie, you were talking about the King 5 report. Okay. But in general, we talk about the King 5 code. So can you explain just briefly what the report consists of?
Yes, that's an important question. Thanks, Liezl. So the report consists of a number of documents, of which the code is one. So the code is a part of the bigger report. The additional documents that the code should be read and interpreted with is the King 5 Foundational Concepts document, the glossary, and then the disclosure framework. Now, the disclosure framework contains the disclosure practices. In King 4, the disclosure practices were included in the code. Now those practices are in the framework. So the framework is really an extension of the code in that sense. Foundational concepts, that is where we explain what I talked about earlier, what the purpose of organizations and governance is. That's where we address all of those issues. We explain the Ubuntu Board philosophy, for example, corporate citizenship, all of those concepts that are critical for an understanding, double materiality, that are critical for an understanding and an interpretation of the code. And then, of course, the glossary, where we explain certain terminology, define certain terminology, that is, again, very important for interpreting the King Code. So the report is the bigger collection of documents, and the code is one of the documents within that collection. But ultimately, they form a whole.
Okay. Well, thank you. I think that it is very important for everyone to understand, Deon. But would you say that one can... I don't have a lot of time. I want to become au fait with King 5, so I just grab the code out of these 4 documents. Would that be sufficient?
I think it would be hard to really make sense of the principles. And what we really want, as Ansie also explained, is not a tick box exercise. That is mindless compliance is the last thing that we want. Mindful application is what we want to see. And I find that especially that foundational concepts document is so important for understanding where does this approach, this stakeholder inclusive, sustained value creation approach based on integrated thinking, where does it come from? How does it fit together? And if you don't understand that the entire code is premised on sustained value creation. In other words, we want companies to create value not only for their shareholders, but for all their other stakeholders in a sustainable manner. In other words, in a manner that not only the company will survive over time, but also the economy in which it operates, the societies in which it functions, as well as the planet on which we do all of these things. Then it might be hard. So my advice always is, also when I teach corporate governance with the IOD essay, go back to those foundational concepts, because there you really get the logic that underpins these 13 principles. So, short answer, I think it's close to impossible to read it with deep comprehension and understanding the meaning of these principles if you don't anchor them in that underpinning foundational concepts and philosophies on which the King 5 Code is premised.
Well, thank you, Deon. And I want to emphasize also when we attended the launch of the King 5, one of the advisory committee members mentioned that you also have to read the foundational concepts document a couple of times to really understand that as well, so that one can apply the code apply the code with thought and mindfulness. Yeah,
and Liezl, it's interesting, if we look at corporate governance codes around the world, they seldom take the trouble of explaining to us where do these principles in a code come from. And any code, whether it is explicit or implicit about its assumptions, always have assumptions. It's also always premised on certain understandings of how do we understand the role of an organization or the role of a for-profit company? How do we understand the role of the board or the governing body? How do we understand the role of an organization within its broader context? And I always found that in the King reports, since the time of King 1 in 1994, that we always provided that context to make sense of what ultimately ends up in the code. And for any student of corporate governance, that foundational concepts document is absolutely key. And I know Ansie and I share the joy of hammering out what ultimately went into that foundational concepts document.
Thank you, Deon. Ansie, I think you wanted to add.
Yes, one small change, small but important change, I think that we made from King 4, and this was Deon's idea, was to add a preamble to the code that just introduces these assumptions and concepts right at the beginning. I think it's only 2 pages long about, with links to the foundational concepts document. So, I think that preamble will make a huge difference, because most people with King 4, I saw it, just skipped, as you said in the beginning, they go directly to the code. We use this preamble idea that Deon suggested also in the draft. And from the comments that we received in response to the draft, we could see that there are some underpinnings and assumptions that we used since King 2 already, which were not appreciated, and people were asking questions in their comments. Why are you suddenly introducing Ubuntu? But actually, it's been part of the assumptions since King 2 already. So I think it's a very valuable addition to the code, this preamble that you can then link back to the foundational concepts document.
The ever resourceful Prof. Rossouw. Thanks, Deon, because that makes that makes it just so much easier again. I mean, and we have to compliment you. All of the documents of the report are written in clear language, without complicated words, and obviously then there's clear guidance as well. So making it, I believe, making it much easier, or will make it much easier for organizations to embrace and disclose. Deon, Ansie mentioned transparency a number of times, but King 5 places renewed emphasis on trust and transparency as ethical imperatives. So what practical steps do you suggest should organizations take to report ethical performance, okay, and communicate their efforts to establish ethical cultures and being good corporate citizens, so that internal ethics processes and then the focus on external ethics as well?
And Ansie indicated in a response to your first question already that accountability only works if there's an audience of stakeholders who can hold you accountable. Without that audience to which you report, there's nothing against which this can resonate, and you really want it to resonate. So the first important thing when it comes to how do we report so that it inspires trust and transparency, I think first of all it is very important that there's a proper process of monitoring your ethics performance over time, in which the information in which you eventually would report to your stakeholders on both your ethical culture as well as your responsible corporate citizenship, that information is well vetted. And this, of course, is where combined assurance becomes very important, so that your report to your stakeholders aren't invented by a consultant, but that it is really harvested from your governance processes. That so over time, as your social and ethics committee receive management reports on both your organizational ethics, in other words, what do we do to manage ethics, and does it result over time in an ethical culture where it has become the norm, or it has become the habit to do the right thing even when nobody is watching? And on the other side, also the reporting on your impact on the economy, the society, the people who work for you, but also on the natural environment, that those reports are really scrutinized, that directors read it with that professional skepticism with which directors should always read management reports. And then you sift that information so that by the time, I'll give an abbreviated version of it in case some of you were able to hear me all along. And what I said, part of inspiring trust in the information that you report on both your organizational ethics and your ethical culture, as well as your responsible corporate citizenship, is that information must be properly vetted through your normal governance processes. In other words, management would report it to, for example, your social and ethics committee. The ethics committee will treat it with the necessary professional skepticism that we are expecting from our directors. And then ultimately, when you come to the point of reporting it to your stakeholders, there has been combined assurance and people can trust the information that you reported. And when you are challenged, as we hope that companies will be challenged also on what they report on their ethics, that you can justify and that you can show that this information wasn't sucked out of my thumb, but it is the outcome of a whole process that forms part of our ongoing governance to ensure that our organization has a strong ethical culture and that we are also a responsible member of the economy, the society, and the natural environment within which we operate. Liezl, I hope this time it was audible.
Perfect. Thank you, Deon. Yeah, I'm very insightful, very insightful. Thank you. Um, I see we have so far 48 questions in the Q&A and in the chat. I also know there are a couple. So I'm going to hand over so that we can ask the questions of the audience to you in the next couple of minutes. And Fatima Rawat, my colleague at the Ethics Institute. Fatima, you have been monitoring the questions. And yeah, the floor is yours. Please ask the questions.
Thank you, Liezl, and good morning, everyone. Huge appreciation, Liezl, from the audience for both Ansie and Prof. Deon's input, and much appreciation to the Ethics Institute for hosting this very timely webinar as well. There's a lot of curiosity on the chat around the application of King towards the public sector. And Ansie, perhaps we can start with you. There's a continuous reference to the terminology around company when we talk. Is this a collective term? Are we talking about company inclusive of organizations beyond just the corporate context? And perhaps while you get to that, while there's so many inquiries in the public sector, what would you say is the required immediate action to not only comply, but also implement King 5 in the public sector? Will King 5 get to a point where it is, there are a lot of questions around enforceability and applicability in the broader public sector, municipalities, government departments, and how can King 5 influence governance in the public sector? So perhaps, Ansie, if we can start with that one for you.
Thanks, Fatima. One of the things that we've decided as an intentional approach with King 4 was to say that King 4 is applicable to all organizations that are incorporated regardless of the form of incorporation. So in short, what that means is that King 4 was applicable to state-owned entities, to municipalities, to non-profits, to medical schemes, to all of those organizations, in addition to companies. And then in King 4 already, we moved away from the language of companies. We talk about organizations. That's also why we talk about governing bodies, because not all of these institutions and organizations that I've mentioned have boards. They have a governing body which may be called a council, for example, or a board of trustees, or whatever may be the case. So therefore we use the more generic term governing bodies. The other mechanism that we used, and this is King 4 thinking already, the other mechanism that we used was that we said that we needed to phrase the principles to be true across all organizations. That's how we bring in all organizations into the code of corporate governance. That's why if you look at principle 1, for example, the governing body should lead ethically and effectively as the focal point of governance in the organization. So how can a state-owned entity say, well, this is not applicable to us? You know, we don't aspire to uphold this. Or let's get something very tangible, the risk. The governing body should govern risk in a way that it optimizes and sustains the ability of the organization to achieve its strategy and to seize its opportunities. I'm paraphrasing a little bit. But how can you say for a state-owned entity, oh no, we don't govern risk, or we don't govern it in a way so that it assists us to sustain our strategy and optimize our opportunities. You can't argue against it. Once you say I'm adopting governance guiding standards, you have to make sense of these principles in your specific situation. So King 5 follows through on that same thinking. We're saying it is applicable, and the principles are applicable universally across. I think the big principle where state-owned entities may have an issue with is the board composition principle, where we say that the the governing body should be comprised with the requisite mix of competencies, independence, and diversity. And then the answer that we receive from state-owned entities is to say, well, we don't compose our own boards. But what does that look like when you uphold that very same principle in a state-owned entity context? That looks like, as a governing body, you introduce succession planning. You engage with the shareholder minister who has the authority to appoint the board to say, these are our requirements. These are the competencies, diversity, and independence requirements that we require to do our job properly. You engage with the minister on, and that's how you then, in that context, uphold that principle. The other thing that I should also just mention is that in King 4, we had supplements for various sectors, which we've now updated and expanded with King 5, and it's on the IOD's website, and those include supplements for state-owned entities, for municipalities, non-profits, pension funds, university, medical schemes, and so on. And these guidance papers explain what I've just explained very briefly with respect to the board or the governing body composition. These guidance papers explain in more detail, those sort of governance issues that you may have in a particular sector and how you deal with it, how you harmonize the implementation of King 5 with the legal and other requirements of that sector.
Thank you, Ansie. Thank you. I think you've covered a lot in your response, a lot of the other questions that participants were posing, and we have posted the links to the IOD website, Ansie, for the colleagues to reference the documents that you've referred to. Deon, perhaps we can come to you, please. There are a lot of questions revolving around ethics and ethical leadership, and highlighting that ethics and ethical leadership of the governing body is critical to achieving societal purpose in acting in the best interest of the organization, and as Ansie has emphasized, within its economic, social, and environmental context. Questions arise around who leads the governing body, who's appointed onto the governing body, and emphasizing the importance of the director competencies to ensure that you get ethical and effective leadership. So perhaps a two-pronged question to you, Deon. The first being the competencies that we would be emphasizing or looking for in terms of director appointments. And then also linked to that is the sense that in many organizations in South Africa, there's a sense of conflation around a zero tolerance culture to fraud and corruption, and that with ethical culture, which is aspirational. What can be done to emphasize in organizations the strategic value of organizational ethics? Deon, if I can hand that to you.
Yeah, and it always struck me, but it's no coincidence that in both King 4 and again in King 5, in the very first principle, in other words, when we start talking principles, the first principle deals with the ability to lead ethically and effectively. And on the ethics side, it emphasizes integrity. The importance of ethical integrity that really culminates in putting your own agendas to the side and taking up a role on a board or any other governing body for only one reason: to advance the best interest of that organization. With the flip side thereof, that you avoid conflicts of interest, because a conflict of interest arises the moment that your personal interest or the interest of someone fairly close to you starts clouding your ability to take decisions in the best interest. And there's also guidance, once again, under the practice guidance under Principle 1 on how we should deal with such conflicts of interest. But then always two other things that are said about integrity that is very important, and that is that we should act ethically beyond mere legal compliance. to never hide behind the law and to say, well, I haven't transgressed the law. The law allows me to do that. So what? It can still be highly unethical and highly irresponsible. And then also that obligation on the governing body to set the tone for that ethical culture in the organization. The other aspect, of course, is not only to lead ethically. We don't want only angels on our governing bodies. We want effective people of integrity. So therefore, the other emphasis very strongly on competence and on ensuring that we have the right people. And this is where your nominations committee becomes so vitally important, to look at the skill set, but also at the balance in terms of not only expertise, but also gender and race and age and all of that, so that you have the right mix, so that you can really lead ethically and effectively. And it's interesting, although currently there aren't any minimum qualifications, we've seen in the amendment to the Companies Act that was passed by the end of last year that the minister now has the right to prescribe minimum requirements. At this point, we have no clue what those minimum requirements are, but when we see amendments to the company's regulations, then we should not be too surprised if we maybe start seeing certain minimum qualifications. I think we already see it for audit committees as well in certain contexts, also in the public sector, that there are certain minimum requirements for members of audit committees. We might see the same for social and ethics committees going forward. Fatima, as for your very important question, the second part of it, this zero tolerance approach, which is basically an approach to ethics that use fear as mechanism of motivation. Because when you threaten someone with, we have zero tolerance, one strike and you're out, you try to scare people to be ethical. And I always say there's room for that. When things really go wrong, I think it's a good starting point, but unfortunately it's not sustainable. For the simple reason that it only works as long as somebody is watching. It's totally dependent on extrinsic motivation. And if we talk about the King 5 aspiration, which says that one of the outcomes is an ethical culture, it means that ethics become simply the way we do business here. It's not only our results that matter, but also how we achieve those results, and that we do it in such a way that we retain the confidence of not only our internal stakeholders, but also our shareholders, our suppliers, our customers, the communities in which we operate. And unfortunately, we know, and the Ethics Institute has done very important research in this regard, that fear-based compliance approaches to ethics can become counterproductive in the long run. It can actually make people less ethically responsible than they were before. So therefore, you would see that also if you look at the practice guidance under organizational ethics, under Principle 2, that it talks about people being familiar with the standards and that you apply those standards, that you recognize when you see the right behaviors as part of your ethics management. But obviously you also deal in a disciplinary manner with blatant transgressions of it. But ultimately, we need to check if over time this contributes and culminates in an ethical culture where people do the right thing out of conviction, out of habit, and not out of fear.
Absolutely. Thank you, Deon. And in responding, you've also tackled a couple of other questions that are being posed by the audience. Ansie, if I can come to you on the practicality of the disclosure framework and the impact of governance that you have very nicely explained to everyone, there's some questions that are coming out around how does one measure the impact of governance? How will one ensure, are there metrics in place? But linked to that, if I can also throw in another question for you, there's this question that's coming out around, is it possible to have good corporate citizenship when at the same time being driven by profit margins? Is it possible in an environment where there are these financial drivers to still talk about good corporate citizenship, and therefore then also the impact of governance as has been set out in King 5? Thanks, Ansie. If I can hand over to you.
Thanks, Fatima. If I may, I just want to add something to the ethical and effective leadership aspect. So, Deon's explained it so well, and what I feel particularly strongly about as well is that ethics and competence, or being ethic and being effective, are not disassociated concepts. And that was brought home to me. And yeah, Deon, we've spoken about this before. I know you also agree. This was brought home to me with the Life Esidimeni, with everything that happened there, and with so many mental patients losing their lives. And the MEC at the time responded and said he did not know what was happening. And that made me think of my legal training, which is what is negligence, or what is the ingredients of being held liable. First, you must have had the intent, or you must have been negligent, and secondly, you must have culpability. So sometimes you don't have the intent to cause these consequences, but that's not an excuse. If you haven't taken the steps and you haven't got the systems to become informed, and then you don't know what is happening, then you're just as culpable. So we also see that a lot of law is now being drafted in that way, to say that you can't walk away from liability if you have not put in place the systems that will enable you to remain informed. And so then when we come to the outcomes, for example, ethical culture, often when I consult to organizations and I say to them, okay, so let's look at King 4 from the perspective of whether you've achieved the outcomes. I would say to the governing body, so ethical culture, have you achieved this? And then almost invariably the answer would be yes. And I would say, how do you know that? And then that's when things come apart. Oh no, then talk about feelings and impressions. That's not good enough. Governance is, yes, use your feelings, impressions, intuitions, of course, always. But there should be practice, system, something more concrete behind that. Fatima, now I've interrupted myself. You asked about the disclosure framework. If you can just give me a keyword, then I'll remember.
Yes. Colleagues were just curious to say, are there metrics? How would one measure that you're achieving those outcomes? Yes. And also linked to corporate citizenship, profitability, and the balance between achieving the outcome.
Right. So, and this is also something that you will only know if you've worked through foundational concepts. The practices are implemented so that they achieve the objectives as per the principles. The principles then, achieving the principles, build up to realizing the governance objectives, the governance outcomes, those 4 outcomes. Now, a governing body, and your question is actually what made me think of the ethical culture example. If what we're saying in King 5, as we said in King 4, you measure your quality of governance through your governance outcomes. And making an assessment of your governance outcomes can't be done disassociated from the practices, and the practices can't be disassociated from the from the principles, the assessment of your governance outcomes you make with reference to your principles, to whether you've achieved the objectives as per your principles, and that assessment can't be made without reference to your practices. So you need to build up the evidence from the practices to say, we've put the following practices in place. This is what we've achieved with the practices under this principle. The objective as per the principle doesn't mean it's done, dusted, you've attained it, you can put it in a drawer, you never have to look at it again. It's ongoing objectives, it's ongoing aspirations that you need to aspire towards with the implementation. So as the governing body, before you can give your opinion as to whether your governance outcomes have been realized, you need to first reference your principles and then your practices. So there's a lot of method behind what we are saying. And so that's also one of the refinements that's been brought in with the disclosure framework, is that the governing body must then express an opinion as to what extent it's realized the governance outcomes. And then we say there, that opinion must be supported by how you've achieved the objectives as per the principles. So how exactly you measure it in terms of the detail, that we leave to each organization. That's the flexibility that's built in. But that's why King 4 was, in a sense, an easy code, but it's also a difficult code. In this, if somebody prescribes you exactly what you need to do, every step of the way, step-by-step guidance, it's almost easy because you just comply. But King 4, King 5, these are not compliance codes. These are mindful application codes. They require judgment. And that's sometimes difficult because it asks for work to be done, for reflection.
Thank you, Ansie. Thank you. I mean, a really practical guidance in terms of translating the guidance and especially an important reminder around the link with the foundational concepts. Deon, last question to you before I hand over Dr. Liezl to you to close up. There's a lot of curiosity around the impact of AI and ethics and governance in a rapidly changing environment. Some last words from you, just from the kind of impact of AI and the governance of ethics.
Yeah, and you would see also if you read through King 5 that there is a principle dealing specifically with the governance of data, information, and technology. And towards the end of that section, there is also a part that talks specifically about AI and the governance of AI. And the important thing is that technology should always assist the organization to fulfill its purpose and its strategic objectives. That's the first premise. These things have no value in themselves. It is about how we embrace them. And then we need, once again, a strategy for how we will embrace them. We need policies for how we will deal with them. And then it mentions very importantly towards the end that there should be ongoing monitoring. And that monitoring should be monitoring against some very basic ethical principles like accountability, explainability, transparency, fairness, privacy, all of these things, so that we keep an ongoing close eye on how these things are playing out, because very often they have unforeseen consequences that only comes to the fore in the monitoring of the application. But ultimately, it comes back to where Ansie just ended, our use of these technologies. And remember, AI is only the start. And we deliberately try to phrase King 5 in such a way that it will not be outdated by the 15th of November 2025. So we talk about emerging technologies. And as Chris Dobie recently said in one of his webinars on AI, we are only in the telefax phase. of AI if we compare that with where we are now with smartphone communication. So it is only the start. But yeah, I think once again, relevant guidance there on how not only AI, but also other emerging technologies can be applied to good use, to sustained value creation, but ultimately always monitored and measured against certain very basic ethical principles.
Thank you, Prof. Deon. Thank you, Ansie. Dr. Liezl, that's unfortunately all we have time for. We will be addressing questions in our post-event communication as well. I'll hand back to you, ma'am, for closure. Thanks, everyone.
Thank you very much, Fatima, and thank you for I see there's 757 questions still left. So thank you for, yeah, I don't know how you did it, but thank you for bringing the essence out in most of the questions. I see huge appreciation on the screen, Ansie and Deon. Thank you. Thank you so much for sharing your insights and your infinite wisdom in terms of corporate governance and ethical leadership and enhancing ethical organizational cultures and corporate citizenship. And I've seen that some people have mentioned the best webinar that they have attended this year, found it very insightful and meaningful. So really huge appreciation from everyone who attended. And then I think what's left for us, us in this webinar, and for ethics and for governing bodies, for compliance officers, for company secretaries, for governance officers, for ethics officers, to just name a few, is to familiarize ourselves with the whole report, starting with the foundational concepts. Thank you so much for your time, Ansie and Deon, that you set aside for us. And then a huge thank you from the Ethics Institute to everyone who joined us today for this very important webinar. I wish you all the best. Bye-bye.
Thank you very much.